Caleb Turner had lived most of his life surrounded by the wide, open land of the ranch. The fields stretched so far that it almost felt like they met the sky itself. Every morning began the same way for him. He woke up before the sun, put on his boots, made a cup of coffee strong enough to chase away sleep, and stepped outside to breathe in the cold air. The world felt peaceful during those early hours. It was the kind of peace that only a life far from noisy towns could give. Caleb was a quiet man, not because he disliked people, but because he had learned long ago that life was easier when he kept to himself. He worked hard, kept his ranch in shape, looked after his animals, and spoke only when he needed to. Neighbors said he was steady, dependable, and serious. No one ever thought of him as the kind of man who had surprises in his life. Even Caleb himself couldn't imagine anything unexpected happening. Every day felt like a page from the same book. The morning everything changed started like any other. The sky was still pale when he stepped outside. The ground crunched lightly under his boots. A cool wind brushed past him, carrying the smell of dry hay. He stood beside the fence, looking out at the cattle moving slowly across the pasture. It was calm, familiar, and exactly what he wanted. He was about to start the day's work when he heard the sound of an engine. At first, he thought it might be one of the ranch trucks he had loaned to a neighbor earlier in the month, but the sound was different, lighter, unfamiliar. Caleb frowned slightly and wiped his hands on the side of his jeans. Visitors were rare. Most people knew better than to drop by without calling first. The engine grew louder, rolling up the long dirt path that led to the front gate. Caleb stepped forward, shielding his eyes from the low morning sun. A small old truck, covered in dust, rattled toward him. It slowed to a stop right at the front gate, which was still closed. Caleb waited, confused and cautious. The door of the truck opened, and a young man stepped out. He looked to be in his early 20s, thin but strong, with hair that looked like it had been pushed back by the wind too many times. His clothes were worn, and his shoes were dusty, as if he had traveled a long way. He stood still for a moment, looking at the ranch as though he wasn't sure he had reached the right place. Caleb didn't recognize him. He walked closer, moving with the quiet confidence of someone used to solving problems alone. The young man watched him approach but didn't look afraid. Instead, he looked nervous in a different way, like someone trying to gather courage. "Can I help you?" Caleb asked in a steady voice. He didn't mean to sound distant. That was simply how he spoke. The young man glanced down, then lifted his eyes again. "Are you Caleb Turner?" Quote, "Yes," Caleb answered, wondering where this was going. The young man took a slow breath, the kind that carried heavy thoughts behind it. "I've been looking for you," he said. His voice shook just a little. Caleb raised an eyebrow. "For me? Why?" The young man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the ground, then at the ranch, then finally back at Caleb, as if deciding whether to speak. When he did speak, his words came out soft but strong enough to stop Caleb in his tracks. "My dad. He made me this way." Caleb froze. He didn't know what the young man meant. The sentence felt like a puzzle with a missing piece. For a moment, Caleb simply stared, waiting for something to make sense. Before he could ask, the young man continued. I think you might be my father. I think you might be my father." Silence fell so quickly that even the wind seemed to pause. Caleb felt his heartbeat slow, then quicken again. This couldn't be right. He had lived a life without big secrets, without surprises. He didn't know this young man. He didn't know what he was talking about. But something in his voice, something fragile yet honest, made Caleb stop himself from dismissing the idea immediately. "What are you talking about?" Caleb asked, more gently than before. The young man swallowed hard. "My name is Evan," he said. "Evan Miller. I didn't know about you until recently. And even now, I'm not sure if I should be here. But I didn't have anywhere else to go." His hands were shaking slightly. He hid them in his pockets. Caleb felt the ground shift beneath everything he understood. He searched the young man's face for something familiar, eyes, expression, anything. but it was impossible to tell in just a moment. "How do you know this?" Caleb finally said. Evan looked toward the horizon, as if trying to hold his emotions together. "My mother told me," he said. "Not long before she—" His voice trembled, and he stopped. "She told me you were a good man. She told me that my real father lived on a ranch, and that he didn't even know about me. She said she never told you. She said she wasn't sure how." Caleb opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. "I knew your mother?" he asked carefully. "Yes," Evan answered. "She said you two met years ago, before she moved, before everything changed." Caleb's thoughts drifted back to a time long ago, a time he didn't visit often in his memory. A time when he was younger, restless, unsure of himself. He did remember meeting a woman around that time, but the details were blurred, softened by distance and years of routine. It felt almost unreal now. Evan went on speaking, filling the silence between them. "I didn't come here to cause trouble," he said. "I'm not asking for anything. I needed to know if she was telling the truth. And I needed to see you." Caleb didn't know what to say. This young stranger had appeared on his land, claiming something that could change his entire life. It felt too sudden, too heavy, but also somehow too sincere to ignore. He studied Evan quietly. The young man stood with a mix of hope and fear on his face, like someone expecting disappointment, but still brave enough to ask for the truth. "How long have you been looking for me?" Caleb finally asked. "Months," Evan said. "My mom didn't leave much information. Just your name. And that you lived on a ranch somewhere around here. I almost gave up more than once." Caleb felt something tighten in his chest, not fear, but something close to empathy. The kind of feeling a person gets when they realize someone has been walking a difficult road alone. "So you drove all the way out here," Caleb said slowly. "Yes," Evan replied quietly. "I thought maybe you might want to know I exist." The honesty in that sentence struck Caleb deep. For a moment, he said nothing. He looked at the land he had cared for his whole life, and then at Evan, who seemed to be carrying the weight of his own whole life in his eyes. Caleb didn't know whether Evan was truly his son. He didn't know what would come next. But he did know one thing. He couldn't turn the young man away. Not when he had come so far. Not when he looked so unsure of where to go next. The morning sun rose a little higher, warming the air between them. Caleb felt that something important, something life-changing stood at his gate. And for the first time in years, Caleb Turner's quiet world was no longer the same. Caleb stood by the gate longer than he meant to, trying to understand everything Evan had just told him. It felt strange, like the ground beneath him had suddenly shifted after years of standing steady. He wasn't used to surprises, and he definitely wasn't used to someone showing up claiming to be his child. But there Evan stood, nervous yet hopeful, waiting quietly for whatever Caleb would say next. Caleb finally opened the gate and gestured for Evan to walk inside. "Come on," he said softly. "We should talk somewhere more comfortable than the driveway." Evan nodded, relief flickering across his face, but he still walked carefully, as if he wasn't sure he belonged there. Caleb led him toward the porch, where a wooden bench sat under the shade. The air smelled like warm earth, and the soft sound of animals in the distance filled the silence between them. Once they sat down, Caleb folded his hands and looked at Evan. "Tell me everything," he said, keeping his voice steady and calm. "Start from the beginning." Evan looked down at his shoes for a moment, gathering his thoughts. When he finally began to speak, his words came slowly, like each one carried its own weight. "I grew up with my mom," he said. "She did her best. It wasn't always easy for her, but she tried. She was strong, even when things were hard." Caleb listened carefully, nodding gently. Evan continued. "She didn't talk much about her life before I was born. I didn't even know she lived anywhere near here once. She moved around a lot when I was young. I always wondered about my father, but whenever I asked, she'd say she'd explain someday." "Did she ever tell you anything?" Caleb asked softly. "Not until recently," Evan replied. "She got sick last year. It wasn't something sudden, it came slowly. And as time passed, she started telling me things she never talked about before. One night, she told me she wanted me to know the truth. Caleb watched Evan closely. The young man spoke with such honesty and care that Caleb felt his heart shift slightly. She said that when she met you, you were kind to her, Evan said. She said you were young, and things were different back then. She didn't say much else. Just that it wasn't anyone's fault that things didn't work out. Caleb let the words settle in his chest. He remembered a woman, a warm smile, gentle eyes, a short time that slipped away faster than he realized back then. He hadn't thought of her in years, but now her memory felt clearer. Evan continued. She told me she found out she was expecting me after you two had already gone separate ways. She said she planned to tell you, but life got complicated. She thought you had moved on, and she didn't know how to reach you. Caleb felt a soft ache inside, a mix of surprise, regret, and understanding. He knew how easy it was for life to take people down different paths. Evan then said something that caught Caleb deeply. She told me that you were a good man. She said you were the kind of person who kept your word and cared about others. She said she believed you would have been there for me if you had known. Caleb's throat tightened at that. He wasn't used to hearing words like that from anyone, and certainly not from someone who might be his son. Evan took a deep breath before continuing. I didn't know what to do with all that information. I didn't know if it was true. But she asked me to try to find you. She said I deserved to know where I came from. Evan's voice softened. So I started looking. I didn't have much to go on, just your name, and that you lived on a ranch somewhere around here. I searched online, asked people in small towns, followed every little clue. It took months. There were times I almost gave up. Caleb shook his head lightly. You came a long way. I had to try, Evan said, his eyes lifting to meet Caleb's. I needed to understand who I am. I needed to know why I feel the way I do about certain things. My mom always said I had a lot of your traits. Even without knowing you. Caleb raised an eyebrow. Like what? Evan smiled shyly. She said I walk like you. She said I like quiet places like you. She said I think before I speak, just like you. Caleb felt his heart soften more than he expected. It was strange hearing someone describe him through another person's memories. And what did you mean earlier? Caleb asked carefully. When you said, my dad, he made me this way? Evan looked embarrassed. I didn't mean it in a bad way. I've always felt different. Not in a negative way, just different from people around me. I never really fit in anywhere. I always thought it was because of something wrong with me. When my mom told me about you, she said I wasn't made wrong, I was just made different. She said I got that from you. Caleb nodded slowly, understanding more than Evan realized. Evan went on. I came here because I wanted to see if she was right. I wanted to see if I came from someone who understood that feeling. Caleb leaned back against the porch wall, letting the truth settle. He wasn't sure what he felt: surprised, overwhelmed, curious. Maybe all of those at once. Evan, he said gently, I don't know for sure yet if I'm your father. But I want to understand. And I want to help if I can. Evan's eyes softened, relief washing over his face. Thank you. I didn't expect anything from you. I just wanted honesty. Caleb stood and walked a few steps away, looking out over the ranch. The morning sun had climbed higher, and the light lay gently across the fields. Everything looked the same as it had every day for years. Yet Caleb felt a shift inside him. A quiet change. He turned back to Evan. Tell me about your life, he said. Tell me what brought you here. Besides what your mother told you. Evan swallowed and nodded. I grew up thinking I had to be strong all the time. My mom worked a lot, so I learned to take care of myself early. I didn't mind. I liked being helpful. But I always felt like something was missing. Not something big, just a piece I couldn't name. He paused before continuing. I tried school, jobs, new towns, but nothing ever felt like home. I kept feeling like I needed to understand where I came from before I could figure out where I was going. Caleb listened carefully. Evan spoke with a kind of sincere honesty that wasn't common, even among adults, much older than him. I didn't come here to ask for money or a place to stay, Evan said quickly, almost afraid Caleb might think it. I'm not here for anything like that. I just wanted to hear the truth, whatever it was. Caleb stepped closer. I don't think you came for the wrong reasons, he said sincerely. You came because you wanted answers. That's nothing to be ashamed of. Evan looked down, his shoulders relaxing a little. I just don't want to be a burden. You're not, Caleb said simply. The wind brushed past them again, soft and warm. The world around them felt still, as if giving them space to understand each other. After a long, quiet moment, Caleb spoke again. Evan, I think it's time we figure out the next step together. Evan looked up with surprise. You're not sending me away? Caleb shook his head lightly. No. You came a long way. And I'm not the kind of man who turns away someone searching for truth. Evan's eyes brightened with a mix of relief and gratitude. Caleb didn't know exactly what would come next, but he knew one thing: this young man had walked into his life, carrying a story that connected their pasts. Whether or not the truth was what Evan believed, Caleb felt it was his responsibility to help him find the answers. And deep inside, Caleb sensed something he hadn't felt in years, a new chapter quietly beginning. Caleb spent most of his life believing he understood himself. He knew his habits, his choices, his limits, and his quiet routines. But now, with Evan sitting on his porch, everything he thought he knew about his life felt slightly different, like a fence that had been steady for years, but suddenly leaned a little to the side. Not broken, just changed. After listening to Evan's story in part 2, Caleb had walked around the ranch for a while. He didn't say where he was going, or how long he would be gone. Evan stayed on the porch, unsure if he should wait or leave. His truck sat at the end of the driveway, dust-covered and almost tired-looking, like it had traveled more years than miles. Caleb needed time. Not because he doubted Evan, but because this kind of truth was heavy. He took slow steps across the ranch, passing the old barn, the corral, and the wide-open fields he had known all his life. The sun was high now, warming the ground and brushing the grass with golden light. It was peaceful, but Caleb's thoughts moved restlessly. He remembered the days when he was young, when he didn't think deeply about the future, when life felt as wide as the sky. He remembered the woman Evan said was his mother. The memory wasn't perfect, but it was warm. They had met during a time when he wasn't ready to settle down. They had drifted apart without harshness, just life moving in separate directions. He had no idea she had been carrying something so important. Now here he was, decades later, facing a possibility he never expected. He took a deep breath and finally turned to walk back to the house. He didn't have every answer, but he had made a decision. When he reached the porch, Evan stood up quickly, unsure of what expression to wear: hope or worry. Caleb stopped in front of him. Evan, he began in a calm voice, I don't know where this is going to lead. I don't know anything for sure yet. But I do know you didn't come all this way for nothing. Evan swallowed hard. Caleb continued, If you're willing, you can stay here for a while. The words hung in the air like they carried their own gravity. Evan blinked, surprised. Stay? You mean, here on the ranch? Caleb nodded. Yes. We can take things one step at a time. I'm not asking for anything. I just want to understand this together. For a moment, Evan didn't say anything. His eyes grew misty, though he tried to hide it by looking away. I didn't expect that, he said quietly. I thought maybe you'd tell me to leave. I'm not that kind of man, Caleb said gently. And if what you're saying is true, then you've gone your whole life without knowing me. That's a lot to carry. I won't turn my back on that. Evan lowered his head, grateful and overwhelmed. Thank you, he whispered. They walked inside the house, and Caleb showed him a small guest room. It wasn't fancy, just a bed, a dresser, and a small window facing the barn. But the room felt warm and safe, something Evan hadn't felt in years. He set his small bag down and sat on the edge of the bed, breathing slowly. The ranch felt like a different world compared to the places he had lived before, quiet, steady, grounded. Later that day, Caleb invited Evan to help with simple chores. He didn't expect him to know anything about ranch work, but he wanted to get to know him through everyday tasks. Sometimes the best way to understand someone was to work beside them. They fed the cattle together, fixed a loose board on the fence, and walked across the fields. Caleb explained things patiently, and Evan listened carefully, asking questions and trying his best. He wasn't perfect at the tasks, but he was eager to learn. Caleb noticed he had steady hands and a thoughtful way of moving, qualities that reminded him of himself at that age. For a while, things felt natural, almost peaceful. But later in the afternoon, the calm shifted. They were repairing a piece of equipment behind the barn. It wasn't complicated, but it required gentle handling. Evan tried to lift a part that was heavier than he expected, and it slipped from his hands. The metal piece hit the ground with a loud clatter, startling both of them. Evan froze, staring at the fallen piece with wide eyes, as if he expected something terrible to happen. Caleb looked at him and saw something deeper than a simple mistake. Evan's shoulders tightened, his breathing quickened, and he stepped back like he wanted to disappear. "I'm sorry," Evan said quickly, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean to break it. I'll fix it. I didn't want to mess anything up." "However, it's fine," Caleb said calmly. "It didn't break, it just fell." But Evan wasn't listening. He looked overwhelmed, as if old memories were pulling him into a place Caleb couldn't see. He pressed his hands together, trying to steady himself. "I always ruin things," Evan said softly, almost to himself. "I always do something wrong." Caleb stepped closer, careful not to startle him. "Evan," he said gently, "nothing is ruined. Everyone drops things sometimes." Evan looked up with eyes that held more years of worry than someone his age should carry. Caleb realized then that Evan wasn't just scared of the mistake, he was scared of the reaction. He was afraid that one small slip would make everything fall apart. Caleb had never been a man of many words, but he knew what mattered most right now. "Listen," he said softly. "If you're my son, then I owe you patience. And even if you're not, you still deserve patience." Evan blinked, surprised by the kindness in the words. Something in him softened, like a tight knot loosening for the first time in years. "Are you sure?" Evan asked quietly. Caleb nodded. "I'm sure." The moment settled between them like a quiet promise. For the first time, Evan felt that someone wasn't judging him, wasn't angry, wasn't disappointed. It was new, almost confusing, but comforting. They picked up the piece together and finished the job slowly and calmly. After that, the day became easy again. They talked a little more. Evan told Caleb about places he had lived, small jobs he had taken, and dreams he never said out loud. Caleb shared stories about the ranch, about learning from his father, and about the long years spent working alone. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with soft orange light, Caleb looked at Evan standing by the fence, the wind brushing through his hair. Something inside. Caleb shifted again, subtle but strong. He saw not just a stranger, not just a visitor, but someone who might be connected to him in a way he never expected. He knew they needed clarity. They needed answers. That evening, while they sat at the kitchen table, Caleb spoke gently but firmly. "Evan," he said, "I think it's time we find out the truth." Evan looked up, curious and nervous. "What do you mean?" Caleb took a slow breath. "A test. A DNA test. Not because I don't believe you, but because we deserve to know for sure." Evan nodded slowly. He understood. It wasn't rejection, it was responsibility. "I want to do this together," Caleb added. "Whatever the answer is, we'll face it side by side." Evan's eyes softened again. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'd like that." The day ended with a calmness that felt new for both of them. Evan lay in the guest room, listening to the quiet hum of the ranch at night. Caleb sat on the porch, watching the stars rise slowly in the clear sky. Nothing about their lives was simple anymore, but for the first time, both felt that maybe this unexpected path was leading somewhere good. A place where healing might begin. A place where family, real or chosen, might finally grow. The morning of the DNA test felt different from all the other mornings on the ranch. The sky was calm, the air cool, and everything seemed quieter than usual, as if the land itself understood something important was happening. Caleb woke up earlier than usual, even before the sun had fully risen. He made coffee, but his hands were a little unsteady, not from fear, but from the weight of what the day would decide. Evan came out of the guest room a few minutes later. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept much, but he tried to smile. Caleb appreciated that. He knew the young man was carrying a lot inside him, questions, hopes, and worries he didn't always know how to express. "You ready?" Caleb asked gently. Evan nodded. "Yeah, I think so." They left the ranch together and drove into town. The road was long and straight, lined with tall grass that waved softly in the breeze. Evan watched the scenery pass by, nervously tapping his fingers on his knee. Caleb wanted to say something comforting, but he wasn't sure what words would fit. He wasn't used to expressing feelings, but he knew today mattered to both of them. Finally, he said, "Whatever the result is, I don't want you to worry." Evan looked at him. "You mean that?" "I do," Caleb said. "I don't want you thinking any answer will change how I see you." Evan swallowed hard and nodded. "Thank you." The DNA test didn't take long. A simple procedure, a few forms, and a reminder that the results would come soon. But even though the process was short, the waiting felt long. When they returned to the ranch, the afternoon sun was already warming the ground. Caleb went back to his chores, moving a little slower than usual. Evan stayed by the porch, looking out at the wide fields. The waiting brought all kinds of thoughts to both of them. Evan wondered what it would mean if the test said Caleb wasn't his father. Would he lose the one connection he had finally found? Would he have to go back to wandering, searching, or trying to build a life without knowing where he came from? On the other hand, Caleb wondered what it would mean if the test said yes. Could he be the father Evan needed? Could he make up for years that had slipped away without him knowing? He wasn't afraid of responsibility, he just didn't want to disappoint someone who had already been disappointed too many times in life. The results came 2 days later. The sun had barely risen when the email arrived. Caleb was in the kitchen, making breakfast, and Evan was on the porch, watching the horizon. Caleb's phone buzzed gently on the counter. He picked it up, saw the message, and knew instantly what it was. His heart beat faster, steady, but heavy. He walked outside, holding the phone. Evan turned toward him, eyes curious, cautious, a little afraid. "It came?" Evan asked quietly. Caleb nodded. "It did." They stood facing each other in the soft morning light. Caleb opened the message. His eyes moved across the words slowly, then stopped. He read them again to make sure he understood. A long breath left his chest. He looked up at Evan, and something warm, almost gentle, filled his eyes. "It says, yes," Caleb said softly. "You're my son, Evan." Evan froze. His breath caught, and for a moment he looked like the world had stopped around him. Then his eyes filled with tears he didn't try to hide. His whole body shook, not from sadness, but from release, like he had been holding his breath for years, and finally exhaled. Caleb stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. Evan lowered his head, covering his face with his hands, overcome by the truth he had been searching for all his life. "You're my son," Caleb repeated gently. "You always were, even before we knew." Evan couldn't speak at first. When he finally found his voice, it was soft and trembling. "I didn't think I'd ever hear that." Evan couldn't speak it for 70. Caleb didn't know how to comfort someone with fancy words, but his sincerity was enough. "You're not alone anymore," he said simply. The days that followed were different from any days either of them had lived before. There was a feeling of newness, like fresh paint on old wood. Not perfect, but full of promise. Caleb showed Evan more of the ranch, teaching him tasks slowly, patiently, explaining the little details that made the work meaningful. Evan listened closely, eager to learn, eager to prove he belonged not just to the ranch, but to the life he was slowly becoming part of. One morning, they worked on repairing an old corral gate. It had been damaged from years of weather, and Caleb had been meaning to fix it for a long time. He handed Evan a tool and nodded toward the gate. "Let's fix it together," he said. Evan smiled, a small but genuine smile. They worked side by side, lifting boards, tightening bolts, smoothing out rough edges. With each piece they repaired, something inside them felt repaired too. Not perfectly, not instantly, but clearly. At one point, Evan paused and looked at Caleb thoughtfully. "Do you ever feel like the things that were broken in your life can still be fixed?" he asked softly. Caleb rested his hands on the gate and nodded slowly. "I think everything can be fixed, if you care enough to try." Evan considered that. "Even people?" "Especially people," Caleb replied. A quiet warmth spread across Evan's face, and he returned to work with renewed focus. They finished the gate just before sunset. The sky glowed soft orange, and the warm light gently touched the land around them. Evan stepped back to look at their work, feeling proud. "It's good," Caleb said, giving a small, approving nod. "It is," Evan agreed. "We did a good job." Caleb glanced at him. "We make a good team." Evan's smile grew slightly wider. "Yeah, we do." Life settled into a steady rhythm after that. More comfortable, more connected. They shared meals, worked together, talked in the evenings. Evan opened up slowly, telling Caleb stories he had never shared with anyone. Not because they were painful, but because he had never trusted someone enough to share them. Caleb listened quietly, offering understanding more than advice, and Caleb, who had lived most of his life in silence, found himself talking more than he ever had. Not long speeches, but simple stories about his youth, his father, and how the ranch shaped him. Evan listened with interest, soaking in every detail, as if learning about Caleb was also helping him learn about himself. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars, Evan said something that stayed with Caleb. "I always felt like I didn't belong anywhere," Evan said softly. "But here, with you, I feel like I'm finally in the right place." Caleb looked at him thoughtfully. "You belong here as long as you want to," he said. Evan nodded, relieved and deeply grateful. The ranch, once quiet and filled with predictable routines, now felt alive with new purpose. Caleb no longer walked the fields alone. Evan was beside him, learning, growing, and building a life with him. Not because of blood alone, but because of the choice they made to show up for each other. The past couldn't be changed. The years they lost together couldn't be brought back. But the future was open, wide, full of new beginnings. And both of them were ready to face it. On the final day of the season, Caleb and Evan stood by the repaired corral gate. The wind brushed gently past them, carrying the soft scent of grass and dust. Caleb looked at Evan, proud of the young man who had walked into his life with a hopeful heart. Evan looked back at him, the feeling mutual. In that moment, both understood something clearly. Family was not just about time or history, it was about choice, courage, and the willingness to build something new together. And they were ready.